When you think of black comic book characters, many that come to mind belong to Marvel. I won't pretend either of the big two have ever been perfect about this kind of representation, but I still imagine a person would have a much harder time naming black DC characters other than Green Lantern and Cyborg, even though there are just as many. It's not because they're unoriginal, those short-sighted complaints are rarely in good faith, and the characters with completely original mantles don't get the chance to shine either. The fact there is a black Batman should be a much bigger deal than it is, but DC has failed at diversity. Black heroes are often relegated to supporting roles. On the off chance that a character does receive their own comic, it'll be a 5 or 6 issue limited series, which the company won't even promote. Most of the time, you'll rarely see a black character outside of a one-shot released to celebrate Black History Month, even if the DC Power anthologies are amazing and worth supporting, for the fact they feature the work of black writers and artists if nothing else. Speaking as a black comic book reader, I find DC's black characters to be their most underrated, and I would like to talk about a handful of them. To provide a rundown on who they are, talk about what I love about them, and also some things I don't love about their treatment over the years, along with the inclusion of whatever history or context I find relevant. Many cite the Green Lantern John Stewart as DC's first black hero. A generation grew up with John as their Green Lantern thanks to the DC animated universe. I think the take on John depicted in the Justice League cartoon has overshadowed that of the source material, which I find unfortunate for reasons I will get to, but I can see why this has been the case. In the comics, John was originally chosen to be Hal Jordan's substitute, and filled a similar role in the later years of Kyle Rayner's tenure as the main Green Lantern. For a time, he wasn't a Green Lantern at all, and even spent some years paralyzed from the waist down, which didn't stick once he got his ring back, even though a disabled Green Lantern could have been really cool. A lot of John's early adventures have been lost to time, which isn't entirely surprising, seeing as Green Lantern Mosaic, one of the character's most influential stories, was written by a person who was sentenced to 6 years in prison for possession of CP. When John's history is referenced, it usually has something to do with the fridging of his wife, Kat Matui, or the time John accidentally caused the destruction of an entire planet, the latter taking place in the second issue of Cosmic Odyssey, a mistake John has spent years repenting for. There was actually an episode of Justice League with a similar premise, except in that version he was framed instead of actually being at fault. It has since become an extremely played out source of conflict. For the longest time, whenever somebody wrote John, it had to be brought up, rarely with anything new to say. Frankly, John's actions that led to the incident were out of character. The story needed John to be extremely arrogant, and it isn't uncommon for a black person's confidence to be unfairly mistaken for arrogance. This is something addressed in not only more recent stories, but even John's first appearance, released nearly 2 decades prior to Cosmic Odyssey, when Hal Jordan does exactly that, only for John to prove him wrong and expose a racist politician for staging an assassination attempt to boost his chances of becoming president. Stories like these are the reason I find it unfortunate that the animated version of John Stewart is seen as the definitive take. In the show, John is an ex-Marine, which informs much of his personality, whereas in the comics, John is an architect. Even in modern retellings of his origin, he only enlisted to pay his way through school, and left because he disobeyed orders. He saw the kind of evil that goes unchecked simply because it is done in the name of the law. He refused to be complicit in such evil. John's ironclad will was inherited from his mother, who was a civil rights leader, an organizer who taught him to use his voice for good. John isn't a stone-faced soldier. He doesn't use his ring to destroy, but to build. It's what makes him the ideal candidate. He was hand-picked by the Guardians of the Universe to be a Green Lantern. John has appeared in a lot over the years, but it's mostly been scattered into bits and pieces. I find that to be absolutely criminal. After all, this is the character considered to be DC's first black superhero, though technically he is not. It was actually a character called Mal Duncan, a longtime member of the Teen Titans. I think the reason many wouldn't count him would be his lack of powers, and for a while he wouldn't even be considered an official Titan, just their one black friend. But he would go on to get his own costume. He'd have a few actually, different names too. Primarily the name Guardian, which originally belonged to a character from the Golden Age. It's obvious they didn't really know what to do with him, and still don't. The role of one black titan per team has now been given to Cyborg. Of all the characters I mentioned in this video, Mal is by far the most underutilized. A big part of who he is also stems from his relationship with fellow Titan Karen Beecher, aka Bumblebee, DC's first official black female superhero. As far as comic book couples go, they're up there with the likes of Rogue and Gambit. I just wish they were treated with that same amount of respect. And I say official because Nubia appeared 3 years prior, in Wonder Woman 204. Nubia was originally Diana's long-lost twin sister, having been made from the same clay. In the current continuity, she's given an updated origin. In this continuity, she was once a human princess, but has since been reborn through the Well of Souls as an Amazon. She is even their current queen. To further set her apart from Diana, she has her own unique weapon too, the Staff of Understanding. I greatly appreciate the fact Nubia has gotten to become more than just Wonder Woman's sister, with a staggering increase in appearances in a relatively short amount of time. I would also like to mention that she is one of DC's black queer characters, and since I'm aware of how few people actually read anything Wonder Woman related, I have a few recommendations. Those being Nubia and the Amazons, Nubia Queen of the Amazons, her story in the 2022 edition of DC Pride, as well as Amazon's Attack from 2023. Already there's a clear pattern. I've talked about characters that rarely get to stand on their own, or characters that have only gotten more of a chance to shine as of late. What about DC's first black superhero to headline his own series, Black Lightning? Well, he's sadly no exception. In a previous video, I briefly touched on how he came to be, how DC's first headlining black superhero was going to be a guy called the Black Bomber, a white racist man with the ability to transform into a black superhero, only for Black Lightning's creator to inform them that this was in fact offensive and create Black Lightning instead. By night, Black Lightning protects his neglected neighborhood in Metropolis from organized gang activity, and by day, Jefferson Pierce is a school principal and father. In the grand scheme of things, his problems are small in scale. He isn't out to save the entire world. He's just doing what he can. His kids, Anissa and Jennifer, are crime fighters as well. Just like her father, Anissa would become a member of the Outsiders as the hero Thunder. She's also a lesbian. Returning to Black Lightning's original comic, as per the theme of this video, his first series didn't even last a full 12 issues. He helped found the Outsiders later on, and he's been on the Justice League, but those stories tend to be the extent of what the character gets to do. Like so many other black superheroes, both before and after him, you more or less only see him in a team setting. His creator has even expressed frustration with this, referring to modern portrayals of Black Lightning as Batman's support Negro, which doesn't sound right coming from a person who looks like this, but I'm kind of inclined to agree. So I highly recommend the most recent Black Lightning series starring the entire Pierce family, because we may not see them again for a while, outside of minor appearances in issues of Justice League, which are not very common to begin with. In Justice League of America 173, one of the character's earlier appearances, he declines an invitation to join. It's actually a very weird issue. Throughout it, the League spies on him, debating on whether they should offer him a spot. Green Arrow vouches for him, and also thinks the team could use a black guy, which Barry Allen seems to take issue with, so it's no wonder Jefferson wouldn't want to join. Though he would eventually become a member in the 2006 Justice League of America relaunch, alongside another prominent black superhero, Vixen. Through the use of her mystical totem, Mari McCabe can summon the power of any animal. She taps into the Red, a power source she shares with Beast Boy and Animal Man. As for her day job, she's a model and an animal rights activist. She's even able to put up a fight against Superman in her first appearance. Later in the issue, the two team up to stop a group of poachers. Among comic readers, Vixen is very well known, and she's been a part of multiple teams, the Justice League, the Suicide Squad, and the Birds of Prey, but once again she would be very lucky to ever go solo, with almost no noteworthy adaptations. Moving on to the modern age, I would like to talk about some characters that are lesser known. Characters only created around the 1990s onwards, such as Steel, not just the original, who came about after the death of Superman, that being John Henry Irons, very subtle name, but also his niece, Natasha Irons, who goes by the same alias and wears a similar suit of power armor. Albeit initially nothing more than her uncle's closest confidant, assisting him from behind the scenes, she would eventually pick up the hammer herself, starting in Action Comics 806, this being after John Irons was put out of commission. She also reprogrammed Superman's robot assistant Keelix, and taught him how to use African American vernacular English. I wonder how the white writer of this comic felt typing this out. Natasha is another one of DC's black queer characters. This same story establishes her relationship with Tracy 13, which has remained a relevant part of her life, going all the way into the 2024 edition of DC Pride. Steel and Steel are unique among those to wear the S on their chest, due to their lack of Kryptonian powers, which I think works in their favour. John and Nat have cemented themselves as essential pieces in the wider Superman mythos. They are the faces behind the company Steelworks, which aims to turn Metropolis into a literal city of tomorrow. After all, these stories take place within a fantastical world where men can fly and CEOs can be good people, sometimes. Speaking of CEOs, another fan favourite is Michael Holt, the second Mr. Terrific. While having no powers, he's as close to superhuman as possible. He has mastered every form of science. His power is his ability to learn. I really like his gadgets, the T-spheres, which pretty much just serve any function the story requires. He's a self-made multimillionaire, currently even the Flash's boss. He took up the mantle of Mr. Terrific after the sudden death of his wife and unborn son in a car accident. As he stood atop a bridge about to take his own life, Michael was approached by the Spectre, who told him of the Terrific before him, Terry Sloan, another person with everything he could possibly ask for except a reason to live. Michael would very quickly end up joining the Justice Society, like the original Mr. Terrific, and even become its chairperson. Another team he has led is the Terrifics, essentially DC's Fantastic Four, so I love them. He has even been reunited with his son, who, as it turns out, was teleported from his mother's womb and raised by Granny Goodness. Comics are so much fun. Michael's son Jeffrey is also a super genius and goes by the hero alias of Fairplay. Another Black Legacy character I'm very fond of is the second Green Arrow, Connor Hawke, the son of Oliver Queen. Connor is also Korean, his mother is biracial, but his one black grandparent's genes were on a mission. I love how he inherited nothing from Oliver except hair color. He was raised solely by his mother, as at the time Oliver wanted nothing to do with him. This, combined with the racist abuse he suffered from other kids, led to severe anger problems, so his mother sent him to train at a monastery. Today he's one of the DCU's greatest fighters. He would become Green Arrow after Oliver's death, but the two would eventually get to know one another upon Oliver's return, with Oliver learning to embrace life as a family man. In 2022's DC Pride, Connor would come out as asexual, which did not come as a shock to anybody. His stories featured a lot of unintentional queer coding. Women would just throw themselves at him because male writers thought that made the protagonist look cool. They were just naturally drawn to him, a trait he apparently inherited from his father, and it was often unusual to him because he spent so much of his upbringing in a monastery, but that wasn't at all how it came across. I'm glad they eventually just outright confirmed that the guy's ace. When going into this, I was pleasantly surprised by how many black queer characters there are. There's always room for improvement, but I expected far less. Now I just wish there were more Green Arrow stories centered around Connor. Ever since returning from the dead, Oliver has been the star again. I feel similarly about Jackson Hyde, aka Aquaman, and formerly Aqualad, likely most recognizable as Calderon from Young Justice, but today they're more or less completely different characters. He was created in 2010 but vanished until 2016, in which he got a big overhaul. Rather than being raised in Atlantis, Jackson grew up in the New Mexico desert, not knowing where he came from, but he knew there was something different about him, other than the fact he was gay. Turns out his mother fled to the surface, going into hiding, as Jackson's father is Black Manta, who is a very interesting character in his own right. Obviously not a hero, but Black Manta technically predates both John Stewart and Mal Duncan. His true identity was a mystery for a whole decade. It wasn't until Adventure Comics number 452 that he finally took off the helmet, and readers found out why they called him Black Manta. Not only that, but the same story featured what may be the most heinous thing this man has ever done, which is kill Aquababy. As far as villains go, his hatred is potentially the most genuine, but Jackson's existence now complicates things. Manta begins to wonder what kind of legacy he's going to leave behind. There's even a story in DC Power 2024 where he beats up a homophobic father whose son reminds him of Jackson. And the 2022 book Aquaman shows him become an unofficial member of the Aqua family, somewhat akin to Dr. Doom's relationship with the Fantastic Four. Jackson has begun to come into his own over the past few years too. It's been cool to see him graduate into the mantle of Aquaman, which is why it's very disappointing to see the latest Aquaman book focus solely on Arthur. Although I can't say I'm surprised knowing DC's track record. Within about 5 years, not that long before he would appear in movies, cartoons, and games, Miles Morales had teamed up with the original Spider-Man, been a key player in Secret Wars, been permanently moved to Earth 616, joined the Avengers, and formed his own team. In almost that same amount of time, Detective Comics have hardly utilized their new Batman. Tim Fox technically first appeared in the late 70s, but he was an incredibly minor character. The version that has existed since 2020, nowadays known as Jace Fox, may as well be new, though he remains the black sheep of the family. Still, I think it was a good idea to bring him back, because I like the way he subverts the traditional Batman origin. He comes from wealth but isn't an orphan. He has quite a large family. Jace Fox's story is one of redemption. His father, Lucius Fox, was never fully present, more focused on his work than his kids, so Jace would act out a lot. Plus, being rich, he could afford to get away with it. One night, while driving home from a party, his eyes not on the road, he ran somebody over. The guy he hit was alive, albeit severely hurt, but Jace panicked and ran away, leaving the man to die. He would feel guilty about it, coming clean to his father, and Lucius would just make it all go away. Lucius in his own way did it out of love, aware that the world he worked so hard to assimilate into is rigged against him. But from there on, Jace would begin to resent the world he was born into. This has become the driving force behind his sense of morality in the modern day. He is now the Batman of New York, with his younger sister Tiffany as his sidekick. So, on top of his great backstory, having his own city to protect means he doesn't have to remain in Bruce's shadow, and having a large family of already established characters immediately allows for a compelling supporting cast. The 2025 edition of DC Power even appears to set up a partnership with Duke Thomas, otherwise known as the Signal, Gotham's daytime protector. This story features an interesting conversation about how they're expected to earn the right to wear the bat symbol, how a different set of rules seem to apply to them. It's extremely meta and on the nose, but definitely an accurate showcase of how black characters like Duke and Jace are seen as bootleg copies, where Red Hood, Nightwing, and Terry McGinnis are near universally praised. This really tends to happen when a character is a somewhat recent creation. I've noticed that some comic book fans have even taken to calling characters industry plants. I personally think a lot of these newer characters have the potential to capture a different audience. One I instantly fell in love with is Sojourner Mullein, a new addition to the Green Lantern Corps. The origin of her name should be obvious, but most people call her Jo. On top of being a queer black woman named after a famous abolitionist, she has the coolest Green Lantern costume by far. The anime inspirations are so obvious. Jo grew up in a struggling New York household. After 9/11, she was determined to make a difference, so she'd forgo attending Princeton to join the army, and later the police force, in a way getting what she wanted. However, each time the difference she made was not a positive one. Disillusioned and out of work, Jo would go to a bar, where she would be approached by a woman who turned out to be a guardian of the universe. Jo first appeared in the series Far Sector, a 12-issue comic under DC's Young Animal imprint, a murder mystery taking place far off in space, on a planet where emotion has been made illegal. So who better to solve it than a hero whose power runs on emotion? Jo has appeared in other stuff since, stuff closely tied to the rest of the DCU, although usually as a supporting character. That said, I am very interested to see what the Absolute Universe take on her is like. Sometimes a strong enough push is all a character needs. It's just that when it comes to DC characters, it's often left to one writer who happens to be a fan. So their attempts to push the character into the spotlight ultimately amount to very little, which is why Vixen and Bumblebee aren't up there with Storm. It's why Duke and Jace aren't on the level of Miles. That's exactly what happened to Naomi, the last character I would like to talk about. She was actually co-created by Brian Michael Bendis, behind Miles and Ironheart. Naomi McDuffie, named after writer Dwayne McDuffie, is a refugee from another Earth. When her world's ozone layer collapsed, forms of radiation that nobody even knew existed found its way onto the surface, and those affected were turned into metahumans. After being sent to Prime Earth for her safety, Naomi would be adopted and raised as a normal girl. During Bendis' time writing Young Justice and Justice League, he made sure to put her on both teams. I think it was a fun idea. Putting a kid on the Justice League of all teams really shakes up the dynamic. However, unlike Miles and Riri, Naomi vanished as soon as Bendis stopped writing for DC, and the show she received in 2022 was cancelled after only one season. Although I definitely think the show happened way too soon, as there weren't really any stories to pull from, I also think live action may not have been the right choice, given the scope of her comics. To once again make a comparison, when Bendis stopped writing Miles after 7 years, a new creative team took over the year his run ended, whereas Naomi didn't get the chance to develop over time, which goes to show that this character was set up to fail. I think out of every character I've covered, Naomi best exemplifies DC's utter failure when it comes to their handling of black characters. I won't point fingers at anybody, and DC has had a really strong lineup of books over these past couple of years. It's a good time to be reading comics, but in the 2020s, during a period in which there's an evident effort being made to take big swings and try something new, I should not have to cross my fingers in the hopes of seeing a character that looks like me more than once a year. I'm not asking for tokenism. I don't need every story to become a series of checklists. I don't need authors to try telling another person's story, or to see non-black characters take a back seat, just to see more of the many wonderful black characters there are. And if the yearly specials for Black History Month and Pride Month are anything to go by, I have to assume there are plenty of writers and artists who feel the same way. Having said all of this, I should reiterate that I am not surprised with the way things are. It is not a surprise that these stories aren't being told as often as they ought to be. If there's anything the 2020s have taught us, it's that companies will do whatever they think is necessary as long as there's money to be made. If they need to, they will try to satisfy the anti-woke grifters. The same publisher that released a line of amazing Asian-led comics in 2023 will not only proceed to hire a writer who has been accused of making racist comments towards Asian people, but they will get him to write Batman. So why would they ever give a shit about black people? Why would they see our lives and experiences as anything more than a gimmick? I would be very happy to be proven wrong though.